Hello, my name is Isabel Rizzo, and I will be speaking in this visual essay around the growing occultism representation that we started to see in media from the 60s, 70s up to today, and how the representation of the definition of witch has also evolved and changed throughout media and throughout culture in North America and the US in particular. So the history and the rise of occult representation, I want to narrow down into a few different lenses that I will be playing with in this visual essay. We're going to be looking primarily at the American perspective. There are many other mirroring experiences happening throughout Europe as well, and very, very much different things are happening around the world. So I just want to narrow it down to the American perspective. We'll be looking at print media, visual media, and digital media, and seeing how those representations and evolving ideas of what the occult is are represented and shown throughout media. So a brief history of the perception of witches really brings a context into why the occult and why witchcraft. And the occult meaning hidden knowledge is going off of Merriam-Webster's definition of the occult. And if we were to look through the lens of ancient cultures, we first start hearing about witches through the Code of Hammurabi, including rituals to clear spells, and also in ancient Egyptian magical high priests were a normal part of the culture. We have these representation of witches primarily as from ancient cultures and documented records of people, usually men, that had these higher roles within society as high priests, as advisors, and also they may be people that were a little bit outside of society that would engage in ritual work or clearing spells, which was partially outlawed. It was an evolving thing in the Code of Hammurabi, where it was really frowned upon to look at somebody on the outside versus working with a high priest to clear spells or curses for people. When we look at the Abrahamic faith, so this is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we first hear in the book of Exodus from the Bible the translation of not suffering a witch to live. So this is the first translation that we start seeing the word witch, and not really having a great connotation, not really having a great denotation either about witches. And in the work of Reginald Scott, spells and words have influence, and I will be using those words interchangeably. Spells are incantations or sentences that have an affirmative power, and words are the magical tools in practice to create that spell. And this mistranslation that came up in the Bible in the book of Exodus argues that mistranslation of witch was actually poisoner. And why this mistranslation may have occurred was because of the use of herbs as a healing modality. And that had a very, oh, how do you know about this, kind of a magical, ritualistic property to it. And this is where it transformed from poisoner, somebody that had a knowledge of herbs, to a witch. So we're keeping that in mind as well, because in the American perspective, the Abrahamic faiths, particularly Christianity, is really taking hold as a foundational religion in North America. If we were to look at the anthropological lens of witches, this is where we have new words of the shaman or the healer of the community. So knowing that witches had knowledge of herbs, had knowledge of rituals, of rites, they were the holders of those traditions, and they would engage in liminal space ritual work with individuals in the community, and people would go to them for wisdom or advice or counsel. When we look at pop culture, and that would be more modern today, the perception of witches we see it as a benign, positive, modern paganism, the normalization slowly of divination from immigrants that have also come in and brought that into America, but also a shift between the colonial view of witches and burning the witch at the stake to, oh, okay, you're doing some interesting arts and crafts with candles as a benign, positive perspective of witchcraft. The definition and main perception that I will be using throughout this visual essay is an outsider that engages in mysterious practices from the mainstream, from eclectic historical modalities of magic for healing. And this can come in the form of self-knowledge, personal development, and collective betterment. So there is, again, this combination of the anthropological, ancient culture, Abrahamic faith, and pop culture melded together to define a witch. So here we're starting off with the 70s, where we have this political and feminist reclamation occurring. Here we have an image of one of the members of Witch, and it's Witches, WITCHES, an initialism for a group of political activists, primarily women, that did not like what was happening at the time, particularly with equality for women, wages for women, reproductive rights. And they would go into protests, feminist protests, and be dressed in all dark with the pointy hat and covering and veiling their face in all black in a cloak and carrying their signs. And this movement still continues and actually has been revived today in more contemporary times. During the 60s and 70s, there is this feeling collectively, and I have a quote here by Ruth Rosen, who is a historian and journalist, very much involved with the reclamation and rediscovery, really, of women's history, that we did not know much about ourselves. And I think this is a beautiful quote that encapsulates a lot of the why of where the witches feminist movement came from, and also the start of the representations of occult and witch identity being shown in TV, in film, and even in music. And she states that we began to realize that we knew nothing about ourselves. I was in the history department at Berkeley, and I knew zip, nada, zero about women's history. We realized we didn't know very much about women as a social group, or women's literature, or women's art. And this is where we have the beginning and advent of the birth control pill. We have more technologies that are available for women to really create more of an individual life. Of course, there were still cultural stigmas at the time of even going in to get birth control, and not having to fake that you were married, to have a ring on your finger to go in and get what you need, or for an abortion, or for reproductive rights if you were not married, to not be shamed. So there was a lot of that internal work that was having to be happening individually, and then being mirrored out through protest, through letter writing, through changing legislation, that women were coming together. And the witches group that you can see here on the left protesting were definitely a part of this coming to terms with their identity and women's history, as well as moving into a new and exciting future that may have more equality for women. In media at this time, we see the popular TV show Bewitched, where the woman in the household, yes, she's still engaging in some traditional feminine roles of cleaning and cooking, but she still has if Heinrich Kramer, the author of The Witch's Hammer, that really started the whole burning of the witches, one of the rules that defined a witch was a woman that had her wits about her, or that she was just a little too smart for her own good. And this is where we start seeing in Bewitched, the protagonist having her wits about her. She was very smart, very much not just a yes person, but she had her own narrative line going, which was really exciting at the time. We also see the season of the witch here as well, and it does still play on the archetype of the femme fatale, yet it brings in more nuance of a woman's journey that was not really represented at the time. There was still some of the old stigmas and archetypes being represented, but we also saw some more nuance that was not present before. And then at the time as well, we had Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, and the Rolling Stones dabbling in occult symbols during the counterculture. And here was one of the album covers using the hermit representation from the Rider-Waite-Smith traditional tarot deck being used as an album cover with the star in the lantern, and very much the traditional archetype that you can see in the major arcana of the tarot. We move on through, and this other height of witch and occult symbolism being a little bit more different. And I think this is where we begin to see the consequences and different ways of nuance that the previous generation really wanted to be represented in media. So we have more of these 90s punk witches, and here on the right we have an image from the teen film The Craft that talked all about teenage issues, from fitting in to growing up to using magic to change themselves. This is where we have teenage psychodrama. And what do I mean by psychodrama in witchcraft and in occult practice? In many different traditions, whether it is the mystical sides of Islam or Christianity or the Gnostics, we know that there is a very important key part to doing ritual, that creates a rehearsed externalization of what's happening in the inner world, right? We can practice something or make a commitment to ourselves, like, oh, I'm not going to eat any more pizza late at night. But when there is a psychodrama of internally, well, this is what's happening to me inside, I don't feel really good about this. And what I really want to call in is this new vision of myself that is eating healthy food, I'm not snacking late at night, to ritualize that on the external. And that can be from burning a candle to writing that down to an elaborate ritual. This is where psychodrama comes in. And it is a very big and unanimous part around different occult practice is, and this is the first known use in 1932 of the definition, is an unrehearsed dramatic play or ritual designed to afford catharsis and social relearning for one or more of the participants from whose life history the plot is abstracted. So we see in The Craft, the film, that the girls that are moving through high school are all learning very different things about themselves, from the shadow, very scary part of themselves at the end of the film, to just trying to fit into a new school environment. And what are the things that we do, from revenge to taking care to boundaries around friendships. So it plays off a lot of those different things that are very much a part of the teenage human experience in America. The other big representations that we have that really skyrocket in awareness are the films Hocus Pocus, which we have here, the three sisters that were raised from the dead on Halloween, and during Halloween, it would always be replayed on television in the 90s all the way to the early 2000s. And then here we have Sabrina the Teenage Witch, which again, we're bringing more of that teenage growing up type of nuance, and we're also adding witchcraft and the occult normalized within media, from the Black Cat as well, Salem there in the image. And we have the Blair Witch Project here in Time magazine, of all magazines, taking part in the mainstream idea of, again, witchcraft and the occult. And I cannot not include Harry Potter being represented here in the visual of media representation that became a phenomenon in media that sold so well, that really influenced culture, normalized witchcraft for a generation, and also I would even argue was just like the Star Wars um, franchise art that came through Star Wars and the whole generation that affected. Harry Potter was that for another generation, and it really changed the way people looked at witchcraft. And it was growing up and you're learning about the characters, and it wasn't a very spooky, scary, occult type of feeling that came from Harry Potter, but very accessible. We move into the 2000s, particularly the 2020s, which we are in right now, where we start to see more politics and psychopomp, psychodrama, and representation in media. And this was actually a statue that was featured in the documentary Hail Satan, which was very much about the separation of church and state, and the idea that if we have pluralism as a society, why is there prayer before a congressional meeting or a local government meeting or in schools? And to have that is fine, but then to demonize other religions, to not allow that and normalize that in mainstream culture, was very much a part of this documentary. And that statue wanted to be put in front of a congressional building that had the 10 Commandments, that had them all up in front of the building. And there was a whole scandal around that, and really challenging the idea of pluralism, saying, well, if there's representation of the Christian religion, or primarily more in Judaic religion with the 10 Commandments, then we should have other statues or representations of other religions here as well. And that was the premise. And we start seeing more and more of this discussion being shared even on regular media channels, of this pluralism and representations of other religions in mainstream media. One of the biggest sold out Guggenheim shows here on the top right, I included Hilma af Klimt's work, where she was an occultist at the time in Europe, very much involved with the Theosophical Society, very much involved with even the Anthroposophical Society, later on an extension of Theosophy, and very much interested in the intersections of science and spirituality and channeling work. And the interesting thing about her work was she knew that the world was not ready. She was also a female artist at the time, that if she were to release her work, the world was not ready. And so she said, in her own words, to keep her art hidden away for a set amount of time, and that it needed to be in a circular temple. And she had this vision about it, and she put it together, and family members resurrected her work, Guggenheim, in a circular building, and it was the biggest sold out Guggenheim show by a witch, which is really exciting because that also spurred this new idea and canon of work that needs to be recognized in art history. So from the witches movement in the 70s to today, we're starting to see the ripple effects of the changing representations of women artists, and also occult practices in mainstream spaces like the Guggenheim and in artistic circles. We also start seeing the resurrection of different histories being represented in America through the best-selling book, The Occult America by Mitch Horowitz, speaking about White House seances, Ouija circles, and the Freemasons, the secret history, the mystic history of our nation, which is a very fascinating read and representation of so many different characters throughout American history that really made America, and how much they were reliant on occult practices from their original cultures, to working with mediums, spiritualists, and that whole rise of spiritualism that happened in America that really spurred from healing to new religions to advice and direction even of politics at the time. So for references and further readings, I wanted to include as well that were taken for this visual essay. I wanted to touch briefly on the far right and occult symbolism, and I included the link for that, which is very interesting because at the beginning of 2021, when we had the insurrection at DC, we started to see occult symbolism being taken and used by the far right-wing political groups as representation, and even neo-Nazi groups. And looking into that, that would be a whole essay onto itself, but really taking on some of those symbols can be really interesting, represented in a negative and very exclusionary way, where previously the feminist occult practitioners and activists did not intend that to be at all separatist. The film that I've also used here was She's Beautiful When She Is Angry, that speaks more on the feminist history of witches and the occult representation that was necessary for a lot of the changes that we see today that made Harry Potter what Harry Potter is, and also Hilma F. Klint to even have the opportunity to be in the Guggenheim, that these women really set those in motion. The book by Kristen J. Soley, Witches, Sluts, and Feminists, that speaks on a lot of the media representation and also political intersections of the occult and witches. The book that I mentioned earlier, Occult America by Mitch Horowitz, The Art of the Occult, that goes through many different artists' works that were inspired by occult practices, mystical practices, their personal, cultural, and religious understandings of the world and how that influenced their artwork. It's a beautiful book, The Art of the Occult by S. Elizabeth. And then for kind of a little bit of the intersection of art history and spiritualism, as well as feminist history, the lecture by Susan Aberth that can be found on YouTube, Channeled Visions, Women, Esotericism, and Modern Art, was a lecture that she did at the Phoenix Art Museum.